Hey, thanks so much for joining us tonight, folks. Can everyone hear me pretty okay? All right, awesome. I've been told I'm very loud. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Kate Condon, museum specialist here at the Birmingham Museum. And today, this is one of our first out of many talks in support of our latest exhibit called A Tapestry of Birmingham, Exploring Our Diversity. And so for both Indigenous and just because it makes sense to start, we're going to talk about the very first people to call this area home, which are Indigenous people, Native American. All right. You'll hear a variety of terms used by these individuals. You know what? Just because I like to start off strong, we are going to start with a hot button controversy in archaeology and anthropology, because that's how I like to start things off. So if you have studied American history going all the way back, you've probably learned about first peoples came to the Americas via the Bering Strait. So they traveled from Asia to North America via Beringia, which was a landmass between Siberia and Alaska that was, as the glaciers were holding a lot of water, a lot of land became, it was dry land instead of underwater, is what I'm trying to say. And if you remember any details about this, you have probably heard the phrase ice-free corridor, Clovis First, and the date of 8,000 to 13,000 years ago. And so we are talking about probably around 14,000 years ago, there was an ice-free corridor in between two glacial sheets in what is now Western Canada that people and the animals that they hunted could come through, and then settled all the rest of the Americas. So then, if we're talking then about Clovis culture, talk a little bit about that. It's named after Clovis, New Mexico, where in 1920, in the 1930s, the very first Clovis point, I'm going to minimize this, which is that projectile point that you see on that screen there. It's called a projectile point. Locally, people call them arrowheads, although it could be on the tip of a spear, as well as things used for cutting and bashing as well. So projectile points fits the name a little bit better. And Clovis points are between 4 and 9 inches long. So these are pretty hefty implements, and they're called bifaces. So they're sharpened on both sides, and sometimes they're even pressure plated to get more of a point on it. And this is the first all-American technology. A lot of researchers think this is the very first thing that was fully invented in the Americas. So we find these points all over the country, although the oldest points are in the southwestern United States region. And we find them in situ with some Mastodon and bison kills. And we find them anywhere between 13,200 and 12,900 years ago. So a lot of people thought that these were the very first Americans, and these were their very first tools, because it lines up pretty well with that geologic timeline that we have for that ice-free corridor. And when I talk about Clovis culture too, I want to make something very clear. We're talking about the archaeological concept of material culture, which is the technology that people use that we find in the ground. Things like religion, social hierarchies, what these people may have believed, those parts of the culture, we don't know. You know, these people all could have followed a very similar religion, a very similar social hierarchy, or they may have already been splitting off into different groups. At this time, there's no way for us to know. But there is a problem with this ice-free corridor and Clovis First theory. And that is, it first came to light in a place called Monteverde, Chile. And we found a site there dating back to 14,500 years ago. And we have other sites dating back to around that time in what is now Oregon, which makes sense, right? The ice-free corridor, it ended right around Oregon, that makes sense. But how in the heck did early humans hook it all the way down to southern Chile in that amount of time? It boggles the imagination. And another thing, the people in Monte Verde, Chile were eating seafood and wild potatoes. So it also kind of stabs our previous theory of these Paleo-Americans as like big game hunters a little bit in the heart. Then we started finding more and more pre-Clovis sites. And it seems like whenever people did get here, they got here pretty rapidly. And so here's a good point for us to stop and talk about what sort of things we do find for evidence of these early Americans. And so we do find human remains, and we'll talk in a little bit about some of the DNA we've been able to pull from these early human remains. And we can date things like organic matter, like bones, through a process of carbon-14 dating. And just a really quick overview of what that is. All plants are taking in carbon all the time from the atmosphere. When you eat a plant, you're also taking in that carbon. So right now, you have carbon-14 in the atmosphere is about even with the carbon-14 in your body. Once you die, you're no longer taking in that carbon-14. It starts decaying at a very steady and measurable rate. And so by measuring how much carbon-14 is in something, we can tell approximately how old it is. So for anything less than 50,000 years old, carbon-14 is great for organic matter. And another thing we find is animal bones. And these can be a little tricky because, as you probably know, if you've ever been out in the woods, when an animal dies, it doesn't stay all as one skeleton. Scavengers come through, they might pull something away. Floodwaters might wash bones away. But so sometimes we are working with only one or two bones that might show evidence of human activity. So on the picture on your left, the top one, that is a bone that has been smashed. It has been smashed in a way that wasn't caused probably by another animal or natural forces. It was probably a human trying to extract marrow from the bone. And on the bottom, on the arrow, we have two little cut marks. And those were actually made with Clovis points. And we were actually able to prove that through the cooperation of some modern day hunters, helping us in a process called experimental archaeology. So we basically make tools in the same manner that we believe the tools were made. We make them about the same size, about the same sharpness, and we actually will give them to modern day hunters and say, hey, if you had to field dress this animal, how would you go about doing it? You know, because you don't want to start nicking bones with your tools, but when you're out in the field, it happens sometimes. And there's only so many ways that you can take meat off of a carcass. So that's really, really cool. And I do have kind of a chart there of some of the biggest prehistoric mammals that these people were encountering, possibly on a day-to-day basis. So we do have things like mammoths and mastodons. We also have giant sloths, giant armadillos, some really weird looking rhinos, just all sorts of really fabulous looking animals. And on the left there is actually a bison skeleton from around Clovis culture times. But unfortunately, a lot of organic matter, like skin and wood, decays. And it's really, really hard to have that preserved over tens of thousands of years. But you know what we have no problem maintaining over tens of thousands of years? Stone tools. Actually, we're not getting there yet. Stone tools. And we can actually use something called potassium argon dating. Works somewhat similarly to carbon-14 dating, but you'll hear that thrown out a lot when we're dating stone tools. And sometimes stone tools are the only evidence that we have that people were in a particular locale at a particular time. But context in which we find these things is super, super important too. And sometimes the context, what's around an artifact, can help us date things really, really well. So you might be thinking, can you date a footprint? Not really, unless the person that left a footprint stepped in seeds and embedded the seeds within the footprint. So these photos were taken fairly recently at a site in what is now White Sands National Park in New Mexico. And it's a desert now, but it used to be a giant lake. And along the shores of the lake, it was muddy, as you might expect. And we find people and animals walking across this environment. And it's really amazing because not only do we see on the bottom right there, that is a giant sloth footprint with a human footprint inside of it. So if you are hunting an animal today, you might stalk it, which is when you're trying to walk in its footprints to minimize the sounds and stuff that you're making. This human might have been doing a very similar thing. And then we also have children. We have evidence of children. So on the upper left, I'm trying to figure out what way is north. The upper left, we have adult human footprints with children's footprints next to them. And these two footprints continue side by side for a while until they both stop. And then they pick back up again. It's only the adult footprints. And if you've ever walked with a toddler, you know exactly what happened there. Because once toddlers are done walking, they are done. Mm-hmm. And the only way you are moving forward is to pick them up. We also have evidence of adolescents playing games, children sliding in the mud. And the footprint next to the adult and children's footprint is a baby mammoth. So we find baby animals as well. And so scientists started testing these seeds, trying to figure out how old they were. And they kept on sending them back to the lab because they were coming back with some incredible numbers. These footprints date from between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. And if you're keeping track, that is almost double when the ice-free corridor was open. And I always work ahead of myself in my notes. So this gives credence to another theory of how humans first got to the Americas, which is called the Kelp Highway theory. And this theory postulates that instead of over land, people came via the sea, whether by boat or by raft, following the coastline, just like people have been doing for thousands of years after that. And so they probably were still in ancient Beringia, hanging out. And if you think about it, the ice-free corridor, once the ice sheets receded, there wouldn't be a whole lot of life. There would be maybe some grasses, maybe some moss, maybe some animals you could hunt. But coming by sea, you have a lot more resources to exploit. You have fish, you have sea mammals, you have kelp and seaweed to eat, all sorts of really great things. And you can move faster over water than you can over land. So here I have, this is actually a map of some of the oldest finds of human remains that we've been able to find and extract DNA from. It's very delicate and a precarious process, but we have been able to find some really amazing remains with some really great dates attached. And this map is actually from 2019. There has been a few more recent findings that actually push it back to around 15,000 years ago for these remains. And I don't really have a whole lot of time to go into genetics, but if you are interested in how do we know how do we extract this DNA, I can't recommend the book Origin, A Genetic History of Americas by Jennifer Raffena. It recently came out just this year, and it really goes into detail on a lot of these things. But there's one important takeaway from this, and that is that these people are closely related to the Native Americans that the first Europeans found when they got to the Americas. And you might think, okay, well, that's kind of a duh statement. Why do I need to state that? And that's because for much of the history of anthropology and archaeology in America, that was simply not something to be taken for granted. When the first colonists arrived to these shores, whether they were Spanish, Portuguese, French, or British, they had a really hard time matching up, seeing these magnificent mounds on the eastern shores of the Americas and the Midwest, the intricate fortresses of the Mississippian culture in the Mississippi Delta, the intricate stonework in Latin America, and imagining that it was created by these people that they saw as brutish, as savage, as unworthy of life. No, these things had to have been made by another culture, a better culture, a nobler culture, and most importantly, a whiter culture. So Thomas Jefferson is often cited as being the first American archaeologist because he undertook some digs in ancient American mounds on his plantation Monticello. And I just want to make it pretty clear, he wasn't actually doing any digging. The people he enslaved were doing all the hard work. But he believed that giants were responsible for the mounds. And yes, this is the origin of, your crazy ants posting on Facebook about giant redheads that used to live in the Americas, and a nebulous network of every single scientist ever is working to cover it up. This is actually where it comes from. Other people at the time thought that Native Americans were actually a lost tribe of Israel. This was very, very popular in the early 1800s. Basically, everyone thought that, except for the Native people themselves. Okay. And you might think that, oh, well, even today, like we're better at that. And unfortunately, sometimes I'm an anthropologist myself. Sometimes we're not so great at that. So if you were around in the 90s and paying attention to the archaeological news, you might have heard of Kennewick Man, sometimes called the Ancient One. And he was an individual who was found in Kennewick, Washington, dates from between 8.9 to 9,000 years ago. One of the most complete skeletons that we have ever found of ancient peoples in the Americas. He was found on federal land, and this touched off a decades-long custody battle between the native peoples and the scientists who wanted to study this individual. So, according to a law that had been passed just a couple of years previous, the Native American Graves Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, it states that any native remains or ceremonial objects found on federal land or that were currently in museum collections had to be returned to the native peoples, either that it came from or the closest group available. So, since the Ancient One was found on federal land, the Umatilla people went to the scientists and asked for this individual back so that they could rebury him. And instead of making a deal with this tribe to study this individual, the scientists took a very interesting route to keep him above ground. And what they claimed was this individual was not related to the Umatilla people because based on his cranial morphology or the way his skull looked, he was actually more Asian than Native American. And two things, trying to figure out someone's racial or ethnic identity via their skull morphology is really tricky and hard to do, despite with CSI makes it look very easy. But you're also very liable to get it wrong sometimes. And we also know that ancient people's skulls morphology had much more diversity than our modern day skulls do. But despite this, they persisted. And over 2 decades later, DNA evidence finally came back that said, oh no, this individual was related to the Umatilla people. And via an act of Congress in 2017, he was returned and buried in an undisclosed location. And there's been a lot of other cases like this. Native Americans, because of these centuries of both oppression and also because individuals and organizations were going in and stealing remains, stealing objects without permission, and sometimes not using these individuals respectfully, a lot of Native American skeletal remains ended up in sideshows, are very protective of these sites. And unfortunately, sometimes the scientists working in these fields don't take that into account. And acts like NAGPRA are one of those stopgaps that we're trying to deal with in order to make things a little bit more fair, a little bit more equitable. So that's kind of the big picture peopling of the Americas. So let's go a little bit closer to home. Let's talk about Michigan. And as you might expect, Michigan, there was a glacier here. Up until around 13,000 years ago is when that glacier receded. And when it receded, it left a lot of our natural environment behind. So a lot of rivers, the Great Lakes, a lot of hills. And the first peoples got here probably around that time, probably looking for mastodons and mammoths and other large animals like that. And when the first animals got here, they kept to the high ground because once a glacier passes through, the land gets pretty swampy. So if you stick to the high ground, you're not going to get stuck. And when the people came behind following them, they also took the high ground and they started carving out trails. And the most important trail for Birmingham history is the one right in the middle of this map. This one right here, this is the Saginaw Trail. Today, you know it as Woodward Avenue. And we have evidence of people using that trail 10,000 years ago. So just imagine old Woodward and Maple 9,000 years ago. Instead of dream cruisers making your commute a living hell, you instead have a family of Mastodon that have decided to take a nap. The more things change. And these were huge systems that crisscrossed the continents. And so you're probably thinking, wait, okay, 12, 13,000 years ago, that's Clovis culture times. Do we have any Clovis sites in Michigan? And you are correct. A, yeah, Clovis culture times. B, we do have sites in Michigan. So right now, as of November 10th, 2022 at 7 p.m., the oldest known site in Michigan is the Belson site in St. Joseph. And it dates back to 13,000 years ago. And it was only discovered in 2020, so it's fairly recent. And what it was a manufacturing site for stone tools. And probably 6 or 7 individuals camped out there for a period of only a couple days. But they were using stone called Attica chert, which was mined 145 miles away, either in Western Illinois or Eastern Indiana. So these people were either extraordinarily well-traveled or they were making great use of that trail system to trade with other groups further south. And right now, more research is being done on lake beds because, again, the glaciers were holding up a lot of fresh water in them, which meant there wasn't as much liquid water to fill up what is present-day Lake Huron. So about 10,000 years ago, this is what the shoreline of Lake Huron would have looked like, vastly different from ours today. And if I still haven't convinced you that people in the past were just like we are today, I offer one last point of evidence. They loved living on the lake. Of course, fresh water, we need fresh water for the continuation of life, something people over the millennia have enjoyed. But also brings animals to the area, which makes it a great place for hunting. Also great for agriculture and for hygiene and recreation. We have evidence of peoples in the Americas ice fishing 2,000 years ago, at least. So right now we are looking more and more at lake beds. The picture on the upper right there is of a site off of what is modern day Alpena. And it is what we call a weir. And it's basically a series of rocks meant to kind of funnel animals in a direction for ambush hunting. So that is super exciting and super amazing. And so let's take a closer look at what are these animals that people would have been hunting. I'm trying to move that out of the way. That's good. That works. So 2 of the biggest ones are mastodons and mammoths. And so what is the difference between them? Well, American mastodons are a little bit shorter, they're a little bit stockier, and they have straighter tusks than the woolly mammoth. And one of the most important distinctions between them is their teeth. So mastodon teeth are a little bit more pointed. They're a little bit more conically shaped, which means that they were better at eating woody plants. Whereas the woolly mammoth was a grazer. Woolly mammoth really loved grass. And as the glacier receded, Michigan became more and more heavily forested, which meant the mastodon had a great time of it. The woolly mammoth less so. And this is borne out in the fossil record. In the Lower Peninsula, we found evidence of 300 American mastodon remains and only about 30 of the woolly mammoth. So I have a picture there, and you can tell the woolly mammoth is about the same size as our American or African elephant. So mastodon would be a little bit shorter. And you can't dig anywhere along Woodward Avenue without finding a mastodon, it seems like. On that lower level, there is a 6-year-old who in 2019 found a mastodon tooth in his backyard and donated a cranbrook. And the other picture there of the young kids, though, that is students from Harlan Elementary, and they're looking at a mastodon molar that we had the Idea Lab 3D print for us. So I want you to do the same thing that I asked my second grade classes to do, which is feel around back your molar, the back teeth there. And kind of figure out how big that is. Mine are about yay, just for a comparison. And for everyone on Zoom, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to come to the museum and see this mastodon molar that I'm holding. It's pretty cool. All right, so another site closer to home, in 1925, these projectile points were found on the former site of the Chatfield farm, which is right across the border from Birmingham in Troy. And these show that not only was there another trail there that we already knew about, going off of the Saginaw Trail, connecting the Saginaw Trail to the Clinton River watershed area, but it was used for a really long time, 9,000 years. These projectile points date anywhere from between 10,000 and 1,000 years ago, which just so shows the longevity of people following this trail. And so I have a picture on the screen there of some of the projectile points, and we do have those on display at the museum right now in our front lobby. So come on by and check them out. There's a pretty good variety of stuff there. So this just shows again, and this is also Attica chert, probably from Eastern Illinois, Western Indiana. So again, evidence of massive trade routes. And these trade routes weren't just through what is now the Midwest. These were all over North and South America. So one of the coolest examples that always blows my mind of these trade routes is obsidian. And obsidian is a shiny black rock. It was highly prized for projectile points because it is about as sharp as glass, and it's a little bit more durable too. And also it looks really cool. I mean, people then as now, we love shiny things. The thing with obsidian is it can only come from areas with volcanic activity. Michigan, no volcanic activity in the last several million years. So the area on the map in red is everywhere where you can find obsidian deposits in the ground. You'll notice Michigan isn't there. We find obsidian everywhere in the Americas, from Michigan to what is now Maine, Quebec, Alaska, all the way down to, again, southern Chile. So this just shows how massive these trade networks were and how many goods were coming back and forth. Another really great example is copper that was mined in the Upper Peninsula. It traveled as far south as the Gulf of Mexico. So these people were not isolated, and they were really just invested in different materials. And so in order to travel the trail system, you need road maps, right? You need signs. And there was no one system of writing. And in fact, I don't think there's any extant systems of writing from Native Americans in what is now the continental United States. So you need something else, and that would be marker trees. They're called talking trees or waganakasing. If you remember one thing from my talk today, Remember that those are called waganakasing. It's one of my favorite words to say. And how these were made, they're trees bent into really interesting shapes. And these were made, this is from Linnell Township in the Upper Peninsula. There's very few that still survive today in the Lower Peninsula. There's still a couple in the Upper Peninsula. But the Native American peoples, they would tie trees down and tie them off in really young trees, really young saplings using twine. And so as the trees grew, they would take on really interesting shapes. And we do believe that there once was an entire language embedded in these trees. Where best to ford a river? Where's a good place to stop and sleep for the night? Don't camp here. There's flash floods in this valley. Things like that. And unfortunately, due to later pushing Native people off of this land, disease, both in the Native peoples and the trees, we lost a lot of those. And unfortunately, we don't have enough to study what that language might have been. But you'll also find trail marker trees all over the country, and not just in Michigan. So when Europeans first came to this part of the country, they encountered people who were part of the Three Fires Confederacy. And these are the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi. And they spoke a language in the Algonquin subfamily of the Algic language. And that is everywhere on red in that map is where the Algic language was spoken. So again, huge area. This was a massive language family. Proto-Algonquin dates from between 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, we suspect. The Algic language family, probably Proto-Algic, was around 8,000 years ago. We don't know where the language first developed and how it spread. So that is a really exciting area of research still going on. And the people of Three Fires were hunter-gatherers, but they also were semi-nomadic. So during the summers, they did practice some agriculture. And in fact, plants that we still have in many backyard gardens today, like squash, pumpkins, and gourd, were extensively used by these individuals. And during the winters, they made full use of the season as well. They really saw the seasons as opportunities and not challenges like we sometimes do today. So during the winter, you move behind the tree lines. The trees block the wind. But it also makes for really great fast traveling on frozen streams and rivers. And again, like I mentioned, ice fishing.
How do you pronounce those words of names?
Oh, the Algonquin or Anishinaabe. Yeah.
Thank you.
It is pretty phonetic as long as, but you have to wrap your head around it first. I used to live in Minnesota where they're changing so many of the place names back to the native names. And yeah, it takes a little bit at first. If you're so used to reading English, which is my only language. All right. And so when the first peoples started settling, well, first settlers were settling the area that is now Birmingham, they didn't encounter many of these peoples. A lot of them were still using the trail system that they set up, which later settlers would follow too, because why reinvent the wheel? If you already have a path through the interior of Oakland County, are you really going to go out and carve another? No, you're not. We've always been lazy too, us humans. But unfortunately, people were already being pushed off of this part of Michigan. So in the Treaty of Detroit in 1807, the Native peoples ceded the territory in yellow there to the US government. Now, a lot of times in these treaties, particularly the two that followed, the Native peoples did retain rights to hunt and fish on the land, and they were not formally pushed out, as in the Indian removal laws of later on in the country. And a lot of people, unfortunately, they saw the writing on the wall. And during the War of 1812, the Native peoples of the region were again put into the middle. This was a conflict between the United States and the British government. And Native peoples found themselves in the middle, and most realized that this is a losing proposition either side. So we're going to try to remain neutral, but others sided with the British. And the reason why they did that is the British came to many of these peoples and offered them a good deal. They're like, we just want the resources in this area. We're going to stop settlement anywhere west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, were they serious about this? I don't know. This is the same British government that basically colonized the entire planet for spices that they never use. So I don't know. I don't know if they would have honored that agreement or not. But unfortunately for many of the Native people in the region, the US did prevail. Michigan Territory remained a part of the US government. And that kind of set the stage for the Treaty of Saginaw in 1819, which further ceded more and more land. And within a period of 40 years, basically the Native peoples of this area lost the entire Lower Peninsula to the US government. But a lot of the earliest settlers in what would become Birmingham talk about meeting Native peoples, especially the young kids. Birmingham at that time, we're talking 18 teens, early 1820s, was the middle of nowhere. So you can imagine as a young kid, you have no playmates until maybe a Native group comes down the trail and maybe settles. We do have some very early maps of the region that do show a Native American camp across the border in Southfield. So we do have recollections of many young children who would go down to that camp to play with the other kids. John West Hunter's wife, Margaret Hunter, talks about how she would sew baby clothes to trade with the Native women for other goods. But past the middle 1800s, the Native Americans had unfortunately already been pushed off, and you don't see those encounters too much anymore. But today, a lot of historians of American culture talk about how the Native American story is the great American story of survival. Because even though they were pushed off the land, even though the American government tried to basically commit genocide for most of our history, they're still here, they're still surviving, and they're still among us. So as of the last census, there were 12 federally recognized tribes within the state of Michigan, and over 50,000 Native Americans on the census. Many of those people were individuals that can trace their ancestry back to the very first peoples that were here pre-contact with Europeans. But others, like these two ladies here, they are part of the Farmer family. And if you've been to several of our other talks, you might have heard about the Farmer family. They were members of a group called the Delaware Moors. And the Delaware Moors really arose in the region of Delaware, as you might expect, and New Jersey. And this was a group made up of Native American individuals, free and enslaved African Americans, and white folks as well. And this mixture lived in that area, had farms, built up a great community. And in the 1850s, kind of in the lead up to the Civil War, they decided to move further away from the South, and a lot of them moved to Michigan. And so the Farmer family, unfortunately, I don't have time to get into it. Please come to our exhibit to learn more about them, or we also have a virtual exhibit on our website that talks a lot about the Delaware Moor people, and particularly the Farmer family, because they married into the Taylor family. If you were at Greenwood Cemetery, you know that we recently discovered graves in the cemetery of two formerly enslaved people who lived in Birmingham, George and Eliza Taylor, and their daughter, Clara. She's the color photograph. She would marry into their family later on in their lives. So thank you so much for joining us today. Before I open up for questions, I just want to talk about, we have several upcoming talks in this series coming up. December 8th, we are talking about Carlos Lopez, And the controversial Birmingham mural of 1942 was a mural that is in the former post office building, now the Surnow building. And there's a really interesting controversy that arose in 1942 in Birmingham, and the story is just full of twists and turns. January 12th, we're talking about Minoru Yamasaki. If you don't recognize the name, you probably recognize his work. He was the architect that designed the Twin Towers and Asian Americans in Birmingham. In February 9th, we're talking about Oakland County's early abolitionists and the local Underground Railroad network. Oakland County was a hotbed of abolitionist movement and sympathies. March 9th, we're talking about the Levinsons, the first Jews in Birmingham. And we're also going to talk about their grandchildren, Sandra and Carl Levin. So if you don't recognize the name Levinsons, you might recognize the Levins. All right, well, thank you so much. And yeah, we can open up for questions now.
Okay,
Yes.
Indian Mound Road. Are there any Indian mounds over in that part of Birmingham?
Not in Birmingham. There were quite a few in this region. Particular, I believe there was one in Dearborn. We do have a couple sites in Birmingham. In fact, there's just a couple areas that might have been just a campsite again for a couple days, a couple weeks. And there is that camp that was in Southfield. But again, yeah, it's really hard to trace that, especially since Birmingham was built up so quickly. And again, you know, if you see an arrowhead on the ground, you're probably not thinking, yes, we must excavate all of this.
So when they named the street, that maybe just like Dinosaur Hill out in Rochester, there were no dinosaurs out there.
Right, they have found mastodons out there.
Yeah.
So.
I think, yeah, but so there's nothing was found in Indian Mountain Road that led them to.
There might have
Name it.
been one, and I'm really not familiar with it, but.
Caitlin, I have a question from the chat. Where is the Chatworth Farm?
Chatfield Farm is, let's go back to that map. It's one of those things like I kind of know where it is, but. Oh, here we go. So it is actually in Troy. Can't see any touch points here.
Is that farm just before Coolidge?
It might be, yeah, it's around that region.
Yeah, there's a pretty open
south
piece of
side.
land there with farming.
Yeah.
Are there any recent archaeological discoveries in the area?
So at the museum, we did have to do an archaeological survey when we're talking about upgrading our park. If you don't know, we do have the John Westminster Park behind the museum. It's really great. It follows along the Rouge River Trail. If you've ever walked that, it's spectacular. And they did identify a couple different places where something might be. So.
The family you were talking about, a couple of photographs of before. You said they come from New York, right?
More or less Delaware and New Jersey. So yeah, kind of Eastern New York.
Why did they come to Michigan? That's a hell of a long way in those days, isn't it?
Right, it really was in the 1850s. And a lot of what they talk about was the good agricultural land. So Michigan was still very much an agricultural economy at that time, and there was still lots of really good agricultural land available.
They're giving it away, basically.
Not quite, but it was pretty cheap, much cheaper than land out east.
Yeah.
And enough land where they could still maintain their own community. So they could all buy pieces and parcels all kind of next to each other. And still continue to live together, work together, intermarry. And that was really important to them.
Did they have any spices?
Spices?
Just being put in.
No, no, it's okay. We can get that. All right, well, I mean, does anyone want to hold our Mastodon roller?
I do have a comment from the chat,
Oh, yes.
and I hope everyone from the chat can hear. I'll unmute, but there's a bit of an echo, so I apologize for those.
From Leslie, the archaeological record in the area does include some sites in the areas along the Rouge River between Birmingham and Southfield. There was an encampment area and temporary reservation during the 1820s near 13 and Evergreen. The state has complete records, but they are protected information to prevent treasure seekers.
And Leslie is museum director, so you don't.
Yeah, she's my boss.
There's not a random person on the chat.
Yes, so if you want a Mastodon or Mastodon tooth of your own, I believe the Idea Lab still has the plans for it. So. Yeah. Oh, yeah, we have a couple at the museum just because, yeah, I love to bring them out for people to like handle. I'm like, just in case.
Question on the Kelp Highway.
Yeah.
I know. So like kind of like just touched on it, like so much of the Clovis ice pathway. Is that like a relatively new concept that like, or is it just like that's the only other solution to how they got there?
So that's always been kind of on the fringes. And with Clovis First for so long, that was like, okay, we don't have any sites predating this. And it matches perfectly with when that ice-free corridor would have been available. So like, why do we need any other solution? And it really was something like that. And then it came back into vogue once we started finding these older and older sites. And actually, I was reading, and it's super interesting, the history of this idea that the first Americans came from Asia. And it was actually first postulated in 1540 by a Spanish explorer who was like, they didn't quite know yet what the region around Alaska and Siberia looked like because it was cold and icy. But he's like, well, it's a heck of a lot closer than people coming from across the Atlantic or across the Pacific. So yeah, maybe there's something up there where people are walking back and forth. And come to find out, yeah, once we started doing more and more geologic work in the area, it was like, oh yeah, no, this is workable. And genetics kind of bears that out too.
What was the indigenous word for that, the bent trees that were used?
Oh, Waganakasing. Waganakasing. So that and at level, best words.
Google doesn't like that word.
No, it doesn't, and I can't remember for the life of me how it's spelled. There's a lot of vowels.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't spell my own first name sometimes. There was a whole day where I spelled my own first name wrong in emails. That was embarrassing. So, you know, you don't have to be totally on top of it to work in a museum, I guess is the major takeaway from this. People have always been the same, and you can be a hot mess sometimes and still find work in a museum.
Don't sell yourself. Looks like a lot of work.
And luckily spell check exists, so.
What's the like accuracy that you can get from carbon dating?
So carbon dating, it does have a little bit of margin of error. And generally it's a couple thousand years, which is why we always give ranges like 23 to 21,000. We kind of build that range right in it. And yeah, sometimes it can kind of move off a little bit based on like what's in the area. Was it contaminated? Like, I don't know, did Ding Dong, like Caitlin come along and put something in her mouth? That can mess things up. So yeah, sometimes you do have to test things several times in order to make sure you're getting a good, reliable date. And yeah, sometimes there has been cases where things, at archaeological sites, you know, something happens, it gets a little corrupted, you test the wrong piece, you get a weird date, so. It's always a little contentious, especially in this field with these further and further back dates. There's always, you know, the old guard who are like, I've built my entire career off of people being here only 14,000 years ago. So yeah, it's a rapidly evolving field, and in fact, there's so many things still coming to light. Like the Belson site in St. Joseph, that was 2020. The White Sands site at White Sands National Park, that was also 2020. So a lot of this work is still going like right now. It's incredible.
There are no other questions in the chat.
All right, cool. Well, thank you guys so
Thank
much for
you.
coming in today. It's so appreciated. And I hope you enjoyed. And if not, you know, my boss is right in the Zoom chat.